I often recommend pregnant women use continuous glucose monitors because blood sugar control is so important during pregnancy. But I had some questions. So today I'm talking to Lily Nicols. Lily is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified diabetes educator, and author of three brilliant evidence based books on prenatal nutrition. She's the founder of the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition and co founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy. And her books on prenatal nutrition are used in academia in maternal nutrition and midwifery and influence nutrition policy, though clearly not enough. I first heard Lily speak at the Metabolic Health Summit in 2024, where she really opened my eyes to not just the detrimental effects of hyperglycemia or high blood sugar in pregnancy, but also how poor the standard dietary advice is that pregnant women are given when they have gestational diabetes. So today, we talk about the combined risks of obesity and gestational diabetes on birth outcomes and the long-term health of children, and also the pitfalls of the standard nutrition advice and what the research and Lily's clinical experience shows that women should be doing instead. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Lily Nicols. Hi, Lily. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So I don't know if you remember, but I first came across you at the Metabolic Health Summit back in January. And, I was kind of blown away by the data that you presented, particularly in terms of how much impact, whether it's weight gain during pregnancy and blood sugar, gestational diabetes during pregnancy, or, just dysregulated blood sugar, even if you don't have gestational diabetes, and how it impacts birth outcomes and long-term health for the child, that I really wanted to have you come on and talk about that, because you really presented a lot of data that was different than a lot of the advice given for gestational diabetes in the United States today. So that's what I'm hoping we can talk about, so that I can, give you a megaphone into another audience. I think more people should hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah. And I think the two things that I heard you talk about were the impact of weight, the weight that you gain during pregnancy, and how important it is to know what's healthy in that area. I'd like to hear more about that, and gestational diabetes and the advice for that, because I think you had, and I wrote down a note here, that there's additive effects of being overweight and having gestational diabetes during pregnancy. Did I remember that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, so they've looked at, going to the weight gain side of things, we have really well documented outcomes of pregnancies and associating them to different levels of weight gain based on pre-pregnancy BMI. Mm-hmm. Everybody likes to trash BMI, and myself included. It's not a perfect measure of health, of course, but population-wide, it's the best that we have for measuring whether your height and weight are relatively proportional. Mm-hmm. And at some degree, as it gets to a certain level, it's going to reflect just an excessive amount of body fat, which generally is not healthy, right? So our prenatal weight gain guidelines are based on BMI categories. You fall into a certain BMI and there's a certain amount of weight gain that's generally considered healthy. And, decades after those guidelines were introduced, we have accumulated a lot of data on looking at what are the outcomes for people who gain beyond that range, or gain too little, or gain within the range. Mm-hmm. And first of all, the vast majority of pregnant women actually gain beyond the range. Like at least half of pregnant women gain beyond the IOM guidelines. About 23% gain below, and the rest of them fall kind of within range. Right. For those who are gaining beyond the expected amount of weight gain for their BMI in pregnancy, we do see a significantly higher risk of things like gestational diabetes. And when you have a woman who has both started her pregnancy overweight and has gestational diabetes, we know gestational diabetes can have its own effects on a baby. We see an additive effect on the child's risk for developing type 2 diabetes later in their lifetime.
Right.
One of the biggest things we're worried about with gestational diabetes is that a mother's blood sugar levels are higher than is ideal, and that can impact the baby's metabolic health for the rest of their life. It impacts the way their pancreas develops. It impacts the amount of insulin they produce. It impacts their levels of insulin resistance. It impacts their adiposity. It impacts their mitochondrial health. And this carries forward with that child for the rest of their life, predisposing them to a greater risk of type 2 diabetes and a greater risk for it developing earlier in life. It's not normal that we're like diagnosing it in toddlers, right?
So it's not just a family history, it's the exposure in utero.
Correct. It's both. So let me pull up I know I had a slide in my Metabolic Health Summit talk that had the specific study that I was citing with like how this changes at different, weight gain or pre-pregnancy weight and gestational diabetes. So for type 2 diabetes developing in the child later in life, the risk for this happening in somebody who starts their pregnancy at a BMI in the overweight or obese category is 2.5-fold higher than somebody who's at a healthy weight preconception. For someone who has gestational diabetes, but is not overweight or obese at the time of conception, the risk is a 3.9-fold higher risk that child will develop type 2 diabetes. And if a mother is both overweight or obese and also has gestational diabetes, that risk is 19.2-fold higher.
You don't see increased risk factor. I mean, I've never heard 19 times higher.
A 19-fold higher risk is pretty rare. Yeah, in the research. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I haven't heard that statistics. I didn't recall that. So that's pretty big. And not only that, I remember I jotted down, I looked at your notes from that conference, and you talked about the risks of gaining too much weight during pregnancy. And some of these were immediate birth outcomes. It was about, one was an increased risk of preeclampsia. So is that also additive with the weight gain and gestational diabetes?
The specific study that I just referenced did not also account for preeclampsia in that particular data analysis, but a lot of the sort of underlying metabolic issues that are going on with preeclampsia share some pathophysiology with gestational diabetes as well, because your blood sugar and blood pressure are pretty closely attuned. Interestingly, preeclampsia can almost occur in like two distinct patterns. I think maybe a preeclampsia researcher might disagree that there's many more, but we have like the undernourishment pattern, because women who gain too little weight or are just severely undernourished, not consuming enough protein, they don't have the structural resources to like adapt to their vasculature to well adapt to pregnancy, or maybe there was an issue with the formation of the placenta in early pregnancy, or some like inflammatory cascade that's going on. And then we have like sort of the overfed, undernourished, maybe I should say.
Yeah.
Excess calories, poor quality fat, high blood sugar, that sort of side of the inflammatory spectrum. That's like another sort of common group that will end up developing preeclampsia. And those are usually the ones who have both gestational diabetes and preeclampsia happening at the same time. So it can kind of happen at either extreme on the preeclampsia, but in the pathophysiology that sort of overlaps with gestational diabetes, that's typically in the group who's starting their pregnancy at a heavier weight preconception.
Right. So, this is actually a question I wanted to ask as we got to later. Can I be patient on this? No, I might as well ask now. When it comes to weight gain, I remember, my children are both older now. So when I was pregnant, 20 years ago, I remember And I was already in this field, and I remember being advised, saying, you should expect to gain so much weight. I want to say the recommendation was like 30 or 35 pounds or something like this. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a standard recommendation. And is there more of a stratified recommendation for weight gain then? That makes sense to me, where if you're underweight, gain this much weight. If you're if your weight is ideal or whatever we're calling it now. And is that more the recommendation now?
Correct. So now we have a sort of stratified weight gain guidelines based on BMI category. So, and then of course there's new research that kind of questions whether these need to be revisited. The reason that they originally even came up with weight gain recommendations in pregnancy was to combat the undernourishment
right.
group, right? This was, I believe it was in the 1980s, don't quote me on that they first came out with guidelines on pregnancy weight gain. And the bigger concern in that era was undernourishment. We need, to consume a sufficient amount of food and micronutrients and protein and whatnot to optimize the baby's development. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of pulling from considerations of like the Dutch famine study, for example, where you have like a population-wide exposure to famine, and then you look at what happens with the offspring of those children who were in utero at the time during the famine, and you see a higher risk of all sorts of health issues developing later in life, blood pressure issues being one of them, heart disease, diabetes, and whatnot. So the guidelines were really focused on women gaining enough. So in the sort of normal BMI category, they recommend 25 to 35 pounds over the course of the entire pregnancy. For women who are underweight, it's 28 to 40 pounds. For women who are overweight, it's 15 to 25. And then women in the obese category or BMI over 30, it's 11 to 20. And now we have newer research from a really broad group of study participants suggesting that, we maybe got it pretty close to correct for the normal and overweight categories. Those ones are pretty spot on. So somewhere in the 15 to 35 pound range. But for women who are underweight, some of them actually might do better gaining more than 40 pounds. Like someone who's really undernourished might need more. And then probably the more significant finding is that women with a BMI greater than 30, they actually might benefit from significantly less weight gain than the guidelines recommend. So that 11 to 20, there's a number of studies that say we should actually break that up into BMI greater than 30, BMI greater than 35, BMI greater than 40, and having weight gain ranges for those subgroups of the obesity category. So there's some research suggesting that for BMI greater than 30, a weight loss would actually is associated with better pregnancy outcomes than the woman gaining any weight over the course of her pregnancy. Not all of the studies agree. Some just say we should have a slightly smaller, range. But for when you get to BMI greater than 40, there's some research suggesting that actually a weight loss of 13 total pounds over the course of pregnancy is associated with the best outcomes for mom and baby. And I've actually worked with a significant number of patients in this population early on in my career when I was doing gestational diabetes work at a perinatology practice, serving the underserved in a very low income area of Los Angeles. I was doing mostly gestational diabetes work. Of course, we know starting your pregnancy overweight is a significant risk factor for developing gestational diabetes. So the majority of my patient population really was starting their pregnancy heavier. Not all, but most at this particular clinic were. I mean, I remember I had a woman whose BMI was over 55, I think, pre-pregnancy. And so I would follow them over the course of their whole pregnancy, advise their nutrition, help them keep their blood sugar in range. And then you see the outcomes, you see them postpartum, right? So it's anecdotal, but I have a lot of N of 1 data, real life experience with this group. And what happens is when you're pregnant, you already have a significant amount of excess body fat on board. Your metabolism in pregnancy is primed to Well, in early pregnancy, you generally store a little bit of fat, but these women
Mhm.
like don't need to because they have maybe 20, 50, 70, 100 pounds of extra body fat on
Mhm.
board. And in later pregnancy, we're primed to sort of tap into those fat stores to fuel the baby's growth. Well, they have plenty of fat on board. So we didn't do any starvation diets, overly restrictive anything. We kept their carbs in check, so their blood sugar was in range, but nobody was under eating. I do not promote a calorie
Right.
restricted diet in pregnancy ever, personally, but they were losing weight. You have like the metabolic efficiency of pregnancy on your side.
Yep.
And then for a lot of these women, I mean, maintaining an excess of 50, 100 pounds of excess weight on board, I mean, yeah, your metabolic rate is like compromised, your BMR is compromised to some degree, but generally that is maintained with just not great diet quality. So if we simply improve the diet quality and get some of the ultra processed foods out, like that naturally just results in a little bit of weight loss. So these women were not starving, believe me. Every time I'd meet with them, I'd be like, are
Mhm.
you feeling satisfied? Are you getting enough? How are we doing? We're watching baby's growth. We're doing all the things.
Yeah.
They simply were losing body fat over the course of the pregnancy. So I'd have some ladies who would end their pregnancy, lighter than they started. And then if they continued eating in a way that maintained their blood sugar balance, sometimes I'd see them, postpartum and they had dropped, an extra 20 pounds or something. It's like
Yeah.
they have their baby, they had lost a little bit of weight, and then I see them at 12 weeks and like, oh, another 10 pounds came off.
Oh, see, that's really interesting. This is actually what I wanted to get to talking with you about because when someone has gestational diabetes, I was inspired by listening to your talk about this to actually look more into the guidelines for gestational diabetes and what's recommended, and then actually parse that out. And because you mentioned this, I mean, you actually said it in your talk, but I'm one of those people. I'm like, I just, you kind of have to like enter your own data and figure it out for yourself to see how it pans out. And I was looking at, I think I looked at both the American Dietetics Association's recommendations for gestational diabetes, and I think I looked at UCSF, and they were giving a sample diet for gestational diabetes. And I did the thing, I use Practice Better, and I did the thing where I put it into my journal, and their recommendations are really interesting. And this is actually where I want to spend the bulk of this conversation, because I'm assuming people would be listening to this going, well, what should I eat and what kind of diet should I follow? And in addition to your books, their recommendations were things like, lunch and dinner, 35 to 45 grams of carbohydrate. And usually in addition, you can have like a fruit or this or that. Anyways, I put in their basic recommendations into my nutrition analysis program that I use. And what I got out of that was a mix. I saw that overall, they were recommending basically 6 meals a day, spread out over the entire day, and up to like right before bedtime, eating right before bedtime, which is something I want to ask you about too. And they managed to get 117 grams of protein, which I was glad to see. But it was almost 260 grams of carbohydrates. And most of those carbohydrates were from milk, bread, whole wheat bread, which I mean,
I know.
anybody who's worked with me or used a continuous glucose monitor knows that I don't care what kind of bread it is, it's going to jack up your blood sugar. Rice, bananas, yeah, milk, grape, like a snack of 10 grapes, which is like mainlining, sugar. So when I saw this, this looks like a diet that someone would come to me and saying, I have insulin resistance, my A1C is going up, here's my diet. And I would look at it and this would be the starting diet. And I would say, right, let's change this. But this is the recommendation that they're giving to people who already have gestational diabetes. So I see this as a recommendation to give someone gestational diabetes. Am I
Yes.
on? Yes?
The logic adds up.
It absolutely, like, it totally blew my mind. I'm like, what is this really what they're recommending?
It's really what
So
they're recommending.
I want to share where my thinking was going, because then I was like, this is what I need to ask Lily. If I was, and I don't work with pregnant women. That's not my patient population I generally work with. But if I was doing this, and I would tend to really pull back their carbohydrates, especially if I had somebody who had, like you, maybe had an extra 20, 50, 70 pounds of fat, energy on board, but they could access, rather than what were they recommending? They were doing like 30% carbohydrates. Anyways, I would have pulled them back to something more like 26% of the calories from carbohydrates, like a 5'4" woman getting 130 grams of protein and 130 grams of carbohydrate max. But it occurred to me that she might be losing, I'm like, well, she might be losing body fat on that. And is it safe for a pregnant woman to be using body fat from a toxin perspective and things like this? So that's where my mind was going. In addition to, is there a reason why we would need to recommend more carbohydrates to a pregnant woman? Because I would think that a pregnant woman mostly needs more protein, fat, micronutrients and things like this. So what kind of diet are you recommending to women with gestational diabetes and these women who are having a healthy pregnancy and actually losing a little bit of weight in the process and improving their body composition while this goes on?
Yeah,
What magic is this?
your line of thinking is describing all of the holes in logic I explored early on in my career when I was like, wait, this doesn't, something is not adding up here, because this person just failed a glucose tolerance test with 50, 75, or 100 grams of glucose. And now this meal plan has like 45 or 60 grams of carbs at each sitting, but they just failed the glucose tolerance test with a similar amount of
Right.
How are we expecting this to help with blood sugar balance? So I don't even know a concise way to answer this. And I hope that I'll have the opportunity maybe to come back to Metabolic Health Summit again and present my other talk, which is on the carbohydrate and pregnancy controversy, or can you go low carb in pregnancy, which is a big part of my work has been really diving into where the recommendations came from. Are they evidence-based? Is it truly going to cause harm if you go low carb, as they say it will? All the controversy around ketosis and pregnancy and all of that. I can tell you, for somebody who has started their pregnancy at a healthy weight, they happen to get a gestational diabetes diagnosis, and they find that a moderately low carb diet, like you're saying, 130 grams of carbs a day or so, helps them with blood sugar balance, that it's not necessarily going to result in weight loss. And I can say, from having had like 2, I'd say moderately low carb pregnancies myself, starting my pregnancy at a healthy weight, I did need to gain in that like 25-ish pounds of weight in pregnancy. That just happens. Like, it's just going to happen.
Right.
No matter how like low carb you are, as long as you're not ridiculously restrictive, which I was not restricting calories. Right. So I wouldn't be concerned about it resulting in weight loss necessarily. For someone who's starting their pregnancy fairly heavy, it probably does result in weight loss, because you're going to naturally, when your insulin levels come down a little bit, you're just going to be like losing some extra water weight as a result. But also you can tap into fat stores more easily between meals for like energy production, instead of having to rely entirely on, being a sugar burner the whole time.
Right.
What you have just described about the guidelines is precisely, what they are. They're high carb, low fat, somewhat moderate in protein. Your meal plan that you're describing actually has more protein than a lot of the ones that I've seen, maybe because it's a higher calorie one. I'm not really sure. But per the guidelines, you have no less than 175 grams of carbohydrates per day in pregnancy. 7 or more of those servings come from starches or breads. 3 or 4 come from dairy and milk. 2 or more servings of fruit. It's lean protein, low fat or fat-free dairy. The protein recommendations are all too low. It's 1.1 grams per kilo. That's too low. We have research showing now that that's too low. And with gestational diabetes, I think the only thing that makes moderate sense is that you just keep the carbohydrate intake relatively even over the course of the day. So the goal is to avoid a massive blood sugar spike if you're having all the carbs at lunch and not having any at dinner. It's just spread out the carbohydrates, right? So 30,
which also to me makes me think they're just going to maintain elevated insulin levels throughout the day and never drop that down.
Will. Yes, they will. Yeah. So their goal, it's like, you look at a meal plan, it's going to have 30, 45 grams usually at breakfast, 30, 45, 60, sometimes 75 grams of carbs at lunch and dinner, and then, 15 to 30 grams at each snack. And yes, they do usually recommend a nighttime snack. That it's controversial. It helps some people with their fasting blood sugar. Depends on the pattern of what's going on. For somebody with pre-existing insulin resistance, often the nighttime snack is not helpful, or at least not a high carb nighttime snack, which of course, since you're spreading the carb load evenly, you end up with usually a pretty high carb nighttime snack. So a lot of what I've done is dive into where does this 175 gram recommendation come from? Why are we following this? Because it doesn't make sense. And really I'll spare you the details on the origins. It's just a lot of assumptions, as many of our guidelines are based on. But the fear of low carb comes from the concept that if you restrict carbohydrates too low, the woman will go into ketosis. And it is believed that ketones harm fetal brain development. That's the conventional understanding. Now, turns out that that's it's just not true. So we actually, as of, I think it was 2024, this year, a study came out looking at pregnant women eating different carbohydrate levels and looking at serum ketones, because a lot of the original research we had on ketones in pregnancy was only looking at urine ketones, which are just woefully inaccurate and not always correlated with blood ketone levels. So a new study finally came out looking at carb intake and maternal serum ketone levels. And there was just no correlation. You had women eating at all sorts of extremes of carb intake, really low, really high, and the ketone levels were all over the map. The state of pregnancy physiology in late pregnancy is such that you tap into maternal fat stores to provide fuel, sufficient and consistent fuel to the baby, which means between meals, a lot of women go into ketosis. Pregnant women go into ketosis more readily than anybody else.
That makes so much sense. Evolutionarily, that makes so much sense.
Exactly. After a nighttime fast, pregnant women are threefold more likely to be in ketosis than somebody who is not pregnant. You think of the overnight fast usually as the longest one, right? Because that baby is growing 24/7. Your glucose cannot or should not be maintained at a super high level at all times. It's also not a steady fuel, right? Glucose is it needs to be at a safe range, but relying solely on sugar and carbs, it's not reliable. We do need to evolutionarily tap into these fat stores for fuel. And so they do. And women who are following a low carb diet are more likely, of course, to go into ketosis. I even I was speaking at a conference in my second pregnancy. I didn't even have a low carb lunch. We went out for tacos, and one of the ketone testing companies was there, and I tested my ketones, and I was positive for blood ketones within 30 minutes of having 3 tacos. What the metabolic efficiency is off the charts in pregnancy. You are simply going to dip into ketosis quite frequently. and it's no concern. So the issues with the whole like, well, what about the brain development thing?
Yeah.
A lot of that was based on studies using urine ketones, and they were really poorly done. So we have like this study from, it was either the 60s or 70s. I don't have it in front of me to pull it out, but they looked at urine ketone levels at the time of admission to labor and delivery, and then like APGAR scores in the baby, or like they might have looked at IQ at a later time point and found a correlation. Okay, when you're in labor and like you're oftentimes not able to eat, depends on how far along you are in labor, you're in ketosis.
You're in
Okay.
ketosis.
Like,
that's my first thought was, that's why women have to be able to be in ketosis and survive, is because labor can last 2 straight days.
Exactly. It has no bearing. The other study, there's a 1991 study that people love to cite that is full of all sorts of holes. That one tried to correlate ketone levels with IQ in babies. And that one has all sorts of holes because the level of blood ketones in the population are at like totally physiologically normal levels. So like in this more recent 2024 study, basically everybody was at the blood ketone levels that 1991 study claimed as like harming neural development. It doesn't make any sense. The data that we do have showing ketones are problematic are in the subset of starvation ketosis. You know, we have studies where a woman was going to have maybe a medically induced abortion or something, and they starved them and then like examined the fetal brain and like, okay, that's problematic, but starvation is overtly problematic to pregnancy as well. Is it the ketones or something else? I don't know, but don't starve yourself. And then the other line of data we have is diabetic ketoacidosis. And that is overtly very harmful for fetal brain development. Of course, you have a, medical emergency going on. You have not only high ketone levels and at ridiculously high levels, but you have extremely elevated blood glucose levels and extremely acidic blood pH.
Yeah.
So we can't say that that's the same as nutritional ketosis. It really is a physiologically built-in system that we can simply tap into burning fat when carbohydrate sources are scarce or food is scarce, which is simply what humans have done forever and ever.
Right. So pretty comfortable with the fact that a lowish carbohydrate diet is safe during pregnancy for the appropriate person. One of the concerns that when I was doing some research that I read about low carbohydrate diets in pregnancy, that kept coming up on the internet was they were worried about neural tube defects and not getting enough folate. They probably said folic acid, but folate. And I thought that was really strange. But the more I looked into it, I realized that they were assuming that they were recommending women get enough folic acid. And the source of that for women, they were assuming was from fortified cereals.
Correct.
But in my mind, and people who, in the nutrition field, natural folate is coming from beans, greens, and of course, liver. And so I wouldn't think that if you're following a balanced diet and eating greens and eating some beans, maybe even getting a little bit of liver, but even the beans and greens, you should get adequate folate to prevent neural tube defects. Is that accurate from where you're coming from?
So what's ironic about this is the women who are often choosing to eat low carb are doing so for some sort of like metabolic health issue or blood sugar issue. And so they're maintaining healthier blood sugar levels as a result. And hyperglycemia is also a risk factor for neural tube defects and a number of different congenital anomalies as well, including heart defects, even below diagnostic levels of prediabetes or gestational diabetes or anything. So I find it kind of ironic, but yes, the widely held assumption is that, we need the folic acid to prevent neural tube defects. And of course, the only places you get folic acid, because it's not naturally occurring in nature, is fortified grains or fortified foods of any kind, but usually it's the grains or supplements that include folic acid. So I think their concern is that if you're eating low carb, you're not eating refined grains, and then you're not getting this synthetic folic acid. Now, I've written very extensively on the folic acid issue. I have a really detailed article on my website on folate and folic acid that people can read if they want to really.
And we'll link to that in the description.
Yeah, if you want to dive into the literature specifically, but essentially, it's odd that people have this obsession with folic acid, because the type of folate, there's many different types of folate, by the way. Folic acid is a synthetic man-made one, but in food, there's over 150 different types of folate. The one that's most commonly found, the form most commonly found in food, is one called methylfolate. And this is also the one that our body uses in its, metabolic functions. So 95 to 98% of the folate in our body is maintained in the methylfolate form. You look at blood, red blood cells, serum, you look at umbilical cord blood, what's being sent to the baby. We're sending methylfolate to the baby, not folic acid. Folic acid is metabolically useless until our body methylates it into methylfolate. So it's really ironic that we have all this, hoopla about folic acid, but people are not looking at the biochemistry of it more closely. And we do have studies in women showing that you can supplement either folic acid or methylfolate. They will both increase folate status in the body. The unfortunate part of the folic acid situation is that not all of it will become metabolically useful, and you have a buildup of what they call unmetabolized folic acid in the bloodstream, and we don't know what that is doing to our bodies, and there's all sorts of theories around if it could be harmful. So if you just consume the methylfolate, you will equally improve your folate status. We know improving your folate status reduces the risk of neural tube defects, as does getting enough B12, choline, B6, zinc, glycine. Like, there's a whole wide array of nutrients that are helpful for preventing neural tube defects, by the way. So in my opinion is, I think we should be focusing on the one that our bodies can actually metabolize, maybe, and not trying to promote people to consume more refined grains. Because 85% of grains consumed in the US are refined grains. 58% of Americans' caloric intake is coming from ultra-processed foods, which are primarily refined grains, added sugars, seed oils, and all the junk that goes with them. It's like, why are we trying to promote people to consume more refined grains? That's like the first thing we need to be.
It's the first thing we need to
reduce. Yeah,
exactly. They're empty. And especially if somebody is carrying extra body weight, is prone to elevated blood sugar, the refined grains actually offer almost nothing, I find.
Yep.
They're excess calories, they elevate blood sugar, and they don't deliver, they're not a nutrient dense food.
Yep.
So what are you recommend? Oh, here's something else that I found curious before I ask you what you recommend to eat. When I was researching, when I was looking into this, and I was thinking, if I was a woman with gestational diabetes, looking this up on the internet, like, what should I be eating? And then I was looking up, vegetarian diets and low carb diets. And I did see the cautions about a low carb diet, like genuine cautions about a low carb diet. And it only ever stated the concerns about neural tube defects, which I thought was strange. And now I'm glad you've confirmed that. And then I looked up a vegetarian or plant-based pregnancy. And I don't promote any certain diet in my practice, but there was lots of, you can have a very healthy pregnancy on a vegetarian or plant-based diet. You just need to be, I'm going to read this. You just need to be mindful about getting enough protein, iron, zinc, vitamin D, DHA, iodine, B12, and calcium. So all of the cautions and red flags that I saw about a low carb diet because of folic acid, and then no cautions uttered, like, you can have a totally healthy pregnancy on a vegetarian diet. but real genuine concerns about all of these things. And from what I've read of what you've published or what you've been presenting, a lot of these are really key for healthy pregnancy and healthy outcomes. And they're major concerns for a plant-based diet during pregnancy. Why am I seeing this again, these illogical recommendations?
Logical conclusions. Yeah, there's a lot of them in the nutrition space. Good question. Good question. I mean, I actually don't know a dietitian who has written more about the issues with plant-based or vegetarian diets than I have. And from the standpoint of like citing the research as to why it's an actual concern, not just throwing out hearsay and opinions, but like, okay, these are the micronutrients of concern. This is why we're concerned. This is how rates of deficiency are higher among these groups. I've never had a plant-based, vegan, vegetarian dietitian provide me. I've asked, nobody has been able to provide me with an unfortified meal plan that meets all the nutrient requirements, because it doesn't exist. It is by default a diet that has a lot of nutritional holes. So I, have trying not to be a disruptor from the very beginning, although that probably sounds funny to people listening to this. I didn't even address the whole vegetarianism thing when I wrote my first book, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. It was like, why am I going to talk about something that doesn't work? My gestational diabetes clients who are vegetarian were always the ones with the most challenging blood sugar control of all, because all of your vegetarian protein sources also have carbs, right?
Right.
It makes it really, really hard. Can be done just from a blood sugar perspective and hitting, protein goals, but is really difficult to actually accomplish in real world life, right? And then in Real Food for Pregnancy, I was encouraged, like, can you just touch on it? So I added like a section at the end of chapter 3 on a vegetarian diet and pregnancy, and I go through a number of
So Real Food for
micronutrients.
Pregnancy has some information,
It has a lot of information on it. So I go through B12, choline, glycine, retinol, K2, DHA, iron, zinc. I'm touching primarily from like the micronutrient perspective and what are the concerns in pregnancy. I do have tips to optimize the vegetarian diet. I think it can be done for somebody who's lacto-ovo-vegetarian and has dairy and eggs. It's trickier, but can be done or get close to being adequate. Vegan, I can't ethically endorse. And then in my latest book, Real Food for Fertility, there's a whole chapter, a very detailed chapter going through even more detail. There's more micronutrients discussed. We're going through so-called non-essential amino acids, going into the macronutrient balance, going into the data on, like our RDA for protein, which is already too low for the population.
Yes, I wanted to ask about that.
The RDA was set for, there's no separate RDA for vegetarians, because the assumption is that 50% of their protein intake is coming from animal sources, dairy and eggs. When that doesn't happen, guess what? Like the protein quality and digestibility and accessibility is so low that they actually need at least 20% more protein than non-vegetarians. That's not in our guidelines yet, right?
Wait, so our protein recommendations are low. I talked about this, are too low for the general population.
Yes.
They are definitely too low for pregnant women.
Yes.
And vegetarian women need an even higher recommendation than everybody else.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, I just think that a lot of the resources from what I have found that have been written on vegetarian nutrition and coming up with these policies that say a vegetarian and vegan diet is safe for all stages of life, including pregnancy and lactation and infancy and early childhood. A lot of these committee opinions are written by vegetarians themselves. I actually had a professor in college who was one of those people. Extremely malnourished, by the way. And so we have this very like one-sided view of vegetarian diets. And if our goalpost for what is an optimal diet is simply our standard nutrition guidelines, it's not that hard to hit nutrient adequacy if your guidelines are saying 45 to 65% of your calories come from carbohydrates. Well, that's easy because the average vegetarian eats 60% of their calories from carbs. If our RDA is the equivalent of 10% of calories coming from protein, which is what a typical vegetarian consumes, great, okay. And now you're within the approximately 30% or less of calories coming from fat. Great, vegetarian vegan diet, perfect on the macros, right? And then you look at the RDAs for our vitamins and minerals, which are set at super, super low levels, very conservative, very low. If that's your target, anybody's diet can meet it, with the exception of, you know, a handful of nutrients that you'll have to supplement with, of course. But these resources do not go into enough detail on what it takes to hit all of those. Like, give me a sample meal plan that is actually hitting all of these micronutrient needs. And if you run, you know, you're into doing micronutrient analyses, and I am too. If you create like an optimal vegan or an optimal vegetarian meal plan, even an optimal pescatarian meal plan, and compare it to an optimal omnivore meal plan, those other three are always going to come out less nutrient dense. Always. It's like you could choose the best of everything in those meal plans, and it's still not going to compare to an optimal omnivorous meal plan. So there's still going to be lower nutrient density. Whether or not your physiology can tolerate it probably depends on genetics and other factors, but a lot of people just do not do well on them.
Yeah. You know, it's funny that this, it's not even funny. I don't know what it is, that it hasn't changed. I remember when I was doing my undergraduate, I had a big gap before my undergrad and my graduate school. When I was doing my undergraduate, I wasn't looking at nutrition. I was studying something else. And, but I took an undergraduate nutrition class, and I found it, of course, really fascinating. And I remember that we had to, this is one of the most, it always stands out to me. We had to do a lot of things like do a daily meal plan for this kind of person and this kind of person and this kind of person, staying in this many calories, this much cholesterol, because of course we were very concerned. This was, and I'll date myself. This was probably in 1989, 88 or 89 when I was doing my undergrad. And also we weren't using the internet. I had to go in and use this big clunky database and enter in all this stuff. And I remember it being so hard, you know, given everybody was very low fat and low cholesterol, because we were in that sort of phase, which I thought we were out of. And I had the hardest time doing it. And when I was going through when you look up, what's a good source of X? What's a great high source of this? And all of the great sources of those nutrients that I kept coming up short on when you were trying to hit all these targets, it was always liver and egg yolks. Liver and egg yolks. And of course, my 1988 brain was like, but we can't do that because that would take us over our cholesterol max.
Yes.
How can I get a nutrient-dense diet with these other restrictions in these needy populations without doing that, without hitting those bad foods of liver and egg yolks? So that stuck with me. And I feel like a lot of these recommendations are there. And how did we come up with recommendations for pregnancy? Were we studying pregnant women? Because we don't study pregnant women very often.
No, the pregnancy protein recommendations didn't come from much data on pregnant women at all. Most of the pregnancy recommendations are based on what they call a factorial method, where they take what our requirements are for men, which are then factored into women, which usually have a smaller body weight, so they adjust them down, and then they adjust them up via some mathematical calculations for how much more is needed for increase in maternal body mass, and how much the fetus is anticipated to accrue over the course of the pregnancy. So they're really very much a best guess. The first ever study that we had that directly measured protein requirements in pregnant women was done in 2015. These still have not made it into the guidelines, by the way. And this technique, this it's like oxidative amino acid something or other technique, this did not exist when the guidelines came out, right? Like we have different ways of being able to measure protein utilization beyond the old school like nitrogen balance studies of like the 80s and 90s. So we're looking at actually like how amino acids are used in the body. And they found that protein requirements in early pregnancy were off by, I believe it was 37%. They were too low. And then in later 39%, sorry. In later pregnancy, they were 73% too low.
Oh my gosh.
An underestimate.
It's no wonder that all pregnant women, it's just a recipe for losing bone and muscle mass.
Yeah. And then start looking at what are our most nutrient dense foods, particularly for the ones that are A, nutrients of concern, things we need more of in pregnancy, and then B, what are the most underconsumed micronutrients? You look at those two things, you come up with protein-rich foods. There was like, it's not just my opinion. There was an analysis that came out. This is well after my first two books were already out, that looked at the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. Ty Beal was the author, one of the authors of the study. And they were looking at 6 major micronutrients of concern. I can't recall all of them, but I know like vitamin A was one of them, calcium, iron.
Retinol, preformed vitamin A or beta carotene?
I'm not sure if they differentiated retinol or beta carotene offhand. I would have to look back at that. But they ranked it for all of these 6 different micronutrients and like how much would you have to consume, like what portion size to hit the requirement. And they came up with a big list of foods. They have a really nice graphics in their study if you want to find it and link it in the show notes. And the top foods were the things you're mentioning: liver and organ meats, fish, especially small fish, shellfish and crustaceans, milk, eggs. It was like all animal foods with the exception of leafy green vegetables. And I think lower on the list, legumes were getting like pretty close there, but it was like animal foods, leafy greens. I was like, oh, that's funny. It's like the list of foods that I'm, talking about being the most nutrient dense. Right. I mean, these are the ones that, fill the coffers of your nutrient requirements and do so in a much smaller portion size.
Yeah. And with almost no impact on glycemic load.
That's the other thing. All of those foods were low glycemic. All of them are low carb.
I know we just have a few minutes left. There's a couple things I want to ask you, and then before we leave. And one, of course, is with your patients, are you routinely using continuous glucose monitors? How are you having your patients track their blood sugar? Is that a thing you use?
So it depends on what they have access to. With CGM in the States currently, although I believe there's did you see the ruling that went through on allowing Dexcom or something to be OTC?
It just came out today. I just ordered it.
Oh, it did. OTC.
Yeah, I ordered it. I ordered it yesterday. Or over-the-counter glucose. Stelo just launched.
There you go.
Abbott is coming out with 2 of them later in the fall.
That will be over-the-counter. So up until this point, we're at a precipice here. It required a prescription or going through one of those services like Levels or whoever. And physicians, depending on who they are, some freely write the prescription and others don't. A lot of times it has to be out of pocket, which can get costly. The other programs that'll link you to them, they'll deny you if you're pregnant. So the access issue has been the biggest one. Now, people internationally who might like be in my online gestational diabetes course where they could just go and get a CGM over the counter and have been able to do so at a pharmacy for a long time, they have much more access. But yeah, we're seeing it increase. Yeah. There's resistance in some of the prenatal practitioners who just, in my opinion, have not kept up with the research. they simply write it off as, oh, CGMs are maybe like it's not necessary outside of type 1 diabetes. They might take that approach, or they'll say that it's inaccurate in pregnancy because of the changes in fluid volume. And that's been shown to not actually be true, because we have a lot of studies on CGM use in pregnancy now. It can significantly improve gestational diabetes outcomes. I just posted a research brief on my Instagram just in the last week or so on CGM use. They gave it to women earlier in pregnancy. It was prior to 17 weeks, everybody got one. And then they looked at their blood sugar patterns over the course of the pregnancy, stratified by who ended up getting a positive diagnosis for gestational diabetes and who did not. And you could see that blood sugar levels were significantly higher in the women who ended up getting a positive diagnosis later on, which provides even more data to what I've been saying forever, which is that a lot of gestational diabetes cases are not just diabetes caused by the placenta or some pregnancy physiology. This is, yes, our pregnancy physiology puts a strain on our pancreas and drives insulin resistance, but the women who are not able to adapt to that normal physiological change and have high blood sugar, there's oftentimes a pre-pregnancy insulin resistance metabolic issue thing that is already going on that we have simply identified at this point in time. So I'm a big fan of CGM for people who have access. I will say the majority of the women I work with simply only have access to a glucometer. So they're just checking their fasting blood sugar and after each meal. And that's better than nothing. I mean, that was what I used long ago and we still had excellent outcomes, but you can get like a lot more data with a CGM and be much more targeted with your nutrition interventions when you have that extra data.
And I'm getting a lot more doctors. I write letters and I get a lot more doctors to order it because, you know, you can get at a pharmacy, your CGM will cost under $40 at a lot of pharmacies with that prescription. I know our time is up. This has been really interesting. And I know we didn't get into the nuts and bolts about, well, what should I eat? Or, you know, I'm right in the middle of my pregnancy and I've been following these old recommendations. Now, what do I do now? And I want to point you towards Lily's books. You know, her last 2 books, I know you can download the first chapter for free from her website. So I'm going to link to her website. And what's your Instagram handle? Is that where you're at the most?
It's the same as my website. So it's Lily Nicols RDN. Yep.
Okay.
And so first chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy is on my website, Lily Nicols RDN. My latest book, Real Food for Fertility, which I co-authored with Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. The first chapter of that is over at realfoodforfertility.com. Okay. And then to bring you back to my website, I do have a free video series on gestational diabetes that is available on my main website, Lily Nicols RDN. So there's a freebies tab that points you to all these things. But yeah, absolutely. Lots of free resources. My blog has hundreds of articles. I've written about my experiments wearing a CGM. Over the years, I have 2 or 3 articles on that if you use the search bar. It'll probably be a little dated because I think my first one was in maybe 2018 when the Libra was still a 10-day sensor, but nonetheless, you know, still useful information on like kind of how to interpret what's going on with your CGM data. Because I think that I would have been overwhelmed having not, you know, I'm a diabetes educator and I've like worked with hundreds of like clients one-on-one looking at blood sugar patterns, and you really have to be kind of a detective to figure out what's happening.
You do. I really think you need support with interpretation.
I agree.
It can freak you out.
Sometimes. It can. And I think also for individuals who are prone to like over restriction or eating disorders, I don't think a CGM is a good idea because they're already too restrictive. And when you see even a moderate blip on your CGM, you're like, oh, the sky is falling, you know, like it can kind of freak people out and make people overly restrict, because guess what? When you don't eat, your blood sugar looks great, right? But that's not good.
Guidance is really helpful.
Yeah. So understanding sort of the patterns and, you know, when to be concerned about a spike or a rise, or when that's just completely normal and nothing to worry about. That's the part that I think, yeah, support is helpful. Somebody like yourself would be good.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And for those of you listening, please, and if you're planning on getting pregnant, if you are pregnant, if this is something that's of interest to you, I can't encourage you enough to look into, you know how we do it. We binge on all the free resources that Lily has available, and then grab one of her books, because I think she's going to have a lot of good diet resources of just like, okay, now what do I eat and how do I plan this? And I think that's just going to be a great investment. So she is the person. She is the resource.
The how-to is in there. It's not just the science. So there's meal plans and recipes in all three of my books. So yeah, take your pick for whatever is your stage of life. And I've had, a surprising amount of questions from people of like, well, which book should I buy? I'm like, well, are you pregnant? No. Okay, get Real Food for Fertility.
Yes.
Are you pregnant? Yes. Okay, get Real Food for Pregnancy. Do you have gestational diabetes? Yes. Okay, also get Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. If you don't have gestational diabetes, you don't need that book, right?
Right.
It hopefully is pretty straightforward, but that's been a common question.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was so nice having you and talking to you.
Thank you. Appreciate the invite.